Thank you to everyone for joining us at this time. I'm Philissa Cramer, the editor-in-chief of JTA. I'm really honored to have here today in conversation Anshel Pfeffer, senior columnist at Haaretz. Want to thank you, Anshel, for being here at a very late hour for you. I think any of us who follow you on Twitter or what used to be Twitter know that you seem to be indefatigable, but it's late. So thank you for having this conversation at this time of night. Anshel is in Jerusalem, where he has been continuing the work he's been doing for decades, explaining and analyzing Israel and Israeli politics through journalism as a senior columnist at Haaretz. And I think, probably most people here consume a wide range of media and Jewish media, and so understand that Haaretz is a left-wing paper, and in Israel, that media organizations do have a political outlook in a way that's different from certainly from JTA and from mainstream news organizations in the United States. But I think I'm going to go ahead and try and speak for everybody here, Anshel, that whether or not folks agree with everything that you write, I think it's hard to read a column that you've written and not come away learning something. So we're all really honored that you're able to join us tonight, to talk about what is happening in Israel right now. I'm particularly excited because we've made kind of a choice at JTA to let the Israeli journalists cover the twists and turns and politics of this momentous time. And so we've been relying on your analysis and others while we focus our coverage on the diaspora. So I am excited to get to understand, to be able to ask you questions. So again, to everybody here, please do leave your questions in the chat. We'll incorporate those. And I think we can just jump in. And my first question is that loaded question that since October 7th, is the first and hardest one to ask, which is, how are you? What is your world like? And what are you seeing and feeling right now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Philissa. And, it's day, I think, 45 or 46 of this war. We're sort of losing count by this time. And despite the time that passes, I think that still the weight of what happened on Simchat Torah on October 7th is still very, very heavy upon us. And I've been doing a lot of visits to IDF units, a couple of them inside Gaza, and to bases and headquarters slightly further away from Gaza, at places where the war is being managed or if soldiers are training. And you keep getting the same kind of answer when you talk to soldiers, I think, of all ages, of almost all ranks, and doesn't matter whether they're young conscripts or reservists who were called up on that day. Everyone speaks of Hashabbat, the Shabbat, like the day and everybody knows what you mean, even though there's been since then 6 more Shabbatot. It's still a day that is really very much weighing upon us. Certainly, I think on soldiers who are involved in everything that's been happening since. Certainly to families and people who were close up, who were involved or had their own relatives hurt or their fate still unknown. And it really is a feeling, I think, anywhere you go right now in Israel, you still feel that there's a day which Roosevelt called the day which will live in infamy. And for Israelis, I think it's a day which won't let go. And obviously time passes and you have more time both to reflect, and also you have slightly increasing moments in which you can think about something else, but it's still, I think, a way off that time when we can pass a few hours without thinking of what happened on that day. And since we're still in this war, and it's hard to predict when it'll end. There's this feeling of heaviness, of a burden that just doesn't leave your shoulders. I can't wait for this to end, but that's how it's not just me. I think almost everybody, if not everybody here in Israel, has been feeling this for the last, by now, 6.5 weeks.
I think I'll pick up where you ended there. Of course, you can't wait for this to end. Can you sketch out the scenarios in which it'll feel like it has reached an end? Like, will that be a moment that we can tell has happened? And what are the kind of end games that you're envisioning?
Well, it's still rather difficult to predict what an end even looks like at this point. We're in the 4th week of the ground offensive. This, the first few weeks after this happened, everyone was saying, when is it going to begin? When is the big ground campaign going to begin? It was obvious the IDF was preparing for this. More and more armored divisions were preparing in staging areas around, and so many thousands of soldiers, both regular soldiers and reservists, had been called up. Many of them were being sent to other places, to the northern border, to prepare for a possible attack by Hezbollah, to the West Bank as well. But obviously, most of the attention was being paid to what was happening around Gaza. And then 3.5 weeks ago, it began, the ground campaign. And we're still, in a way, in that first stage, because what's happening here is something we haven't seen in any of the rounds of warfare with Gaza, where a whole section, basically the whole northern half of the Gaza Strip becoming a war zone, where large IDF forces going in and operating. And we had in 2009, and then again in 2014, there were ground campaigns, but the scale of both the scale of the forces and the areas into which they entered in Gaza were nothing close to what's happening now. So we're still in this stage where IDF which has poured a very large volume of ground forces into that sector, are still operating there in many different areas in and around Gaza City. A lot of the attention, obviously, in the last few days has been in Al-Shifa Hospital. That is, I think, to some degree rather misleading, because the real issues are how much ground, ground. When I talk about ground, I mean overground and underground as well. The IDF will go through in this stage, and we don't even know when this stage will end. It's partly to do with diplomatic concerns, that there is obviously its important legitimacy and the cover that Israel receives from its allies, chief of which is the United States. How long will there be that support for this really very heavy firepower and level of forces that Israel's using in and around Gaza City? And then at what point also will the IDF say, we felt that, the generals, those who are doing the intelligence assessments, will say, well, we feel that we've achieved this goal of seriously degrading, if not destroying, Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza. And then once we reach that stage, then there's still two big question marks: is if and when and how the IDF will continue on this campaign in the southern part of Gaza, and along with that is the question, what's going to happen on the humanitarian level, because now over 1 million people who have left northern Gaza have joined nearly another 1 million people who lived in the south of the Gaza Strip. So you have this huge mass of over 2 million Palestinians in the south of Gaza Strip. There's massive humanitarian issues that need to be dealt with: food, water, supplies, medicine, shelter. Winter's just begun here. All the things to do with health, with public health, because you have that level of people crowded in a relatively small space. You've got bodies, you've got so many other issues that could lead to widespread disease. All these things are going to have to are already being addressed. I don't think they're being addressed enough openly by the Israeli government, and we'll probably get to that in a moment. But these are the two big challenges which we're facing Israel. When at some point there's a feeling that they've more or less achieved what they set out to achieve in the northern part of Gaza, how to address it both militarily and how to address the humanitarian aid aspect. And of course, also then the diplomatic issues, the support that Israel's getting from the United States and from other allies will also be a major part of whatever happens next. So I can't really say what's an end at this point. I think we should be just looking at what's the next phase of this war. And all of this is based on the assumption that we're still only talking about the war in Gaza, because the situation on the northern border with Hezbollah is basically a daily low-intensity war. Is that something that will escalate? Is that something that Israel will have to address in some way, or maybe Hezbollah will escalate? So we really are. First of all, this is the longest war that we've had, probably I think since, unless you counsel the low-level war of attrition with Egypt in the late '60s, but this is the longest war we've had I think in our lifetimes, and except those of us who are perhaps old enough to remember the War of Independence, Israel's War of Independence. But it's really a long affair that I wish I could say to you, this is where I see it ending. But at this point, it really would be premature to even try and describe what an end to this war looks like. And part of the reason for that is that the dysfunctionality of the Netanyahu government, the way that the prime minister is so scared of his partners, is so incapable of committing to any real after the war strategy, also means that we're not even getting any kind of message from the government as how they see this war ending in some best case scenario. That I wish I could give you a more conclusive answer to you. It's a very good question, and sadly I don't have any good answers for it.
So you wrote a biography of Benjamin Netanyahu, of Bibi, and I think before this year, certainly before October 7th, before this year, even his detractors would acknowledge, we've been safe, we've been secure, and even in the first 9 months of this year, when Israel was torn from within, I think there was a real sense that, like, well, if the shit hits the fan, like, we'll still get things under control. Like, probably that will happen. Like, we could that, and I feel like I heard that from so many people, and I'd love to hear your perspective on, like, I guess, were you among those, or were you, or kind of, is this a fear that you had? How had you thought about this in advance? How are you thinking about the state of the security apparatus, and now knowing what you know as one of the greatest experts on Bibi, like, what's going on in his head, and can you say a little bit more about the leadership that you're seeing or not seeing?
I'm not seeing leadership, and I have to say I certainly did not predict or foresee anything that happened on October 7th, but the feeling that many Israelis had, including opponents of Netanyahu, in his previous terms and his long term between 2009 and 2021, that yes, there's a lot of bad things about him. He's corrupt, he's divisive, he's incapable of saying the truth. All those things, there was at least a feeling that this is a man who isn't going to go on crazy military adventures. Netanyahu doesn't like using the big army. He never wanted to launch a big war. I mean, he spoke all kinds of tough stuff about war against Iran. He never really did it. And towards the end of the research on my book, which came out in 2018, I commissioned some data analysis. I didn't do it myself because I'm terrible at numbers, but I had this feeling that the question I was asking would give the answer that I thought it would be, was that Netanyahu, if you take Israel's casualty rate, the number of Israelis killed, both civilians and soldiers, killed throughout Israel's history in acts of violence, wars, and terror attacks, and you do a yearly average of each prime minister's term, I thought that Netanyahu's casualty rate would be the lowest, and I commissioned from somebody who does understand a bit about how to do numbers and statistics. I commissioned some data analysis to check this out, and I was right. Netanyahu, until 2018, when that was the research, that was when the research was carried out. He had the lowest casualty rates, lowest annual casualty rate of any Israeli prime minister, which was something, my book was critical in many ways. Some people say it wasn't critical enough. Some people it's too critical. That depends where you stand. But I thought it was important, and that's why I wrote, and that's why I basically ended the book with the saying, for all the criticism of Netanyahu, he has had the lowest casualty rate of any prime minister, and for all the criticism of him, that this is also a result of his careful, some would say over careful, some would say obstinate strategy and way of running Israel. So this was something that had to be said in his favor. I did not feel that anywhere near as secure, not on October 7, but basically from the moment that he won the election, and it was clear what coalition he was going to build. Because when you appoint Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is not just the most far-right fascist in Israeli politics, but he's also a man who has no responsibility whatsoever, has no experience of running anything but a tiny law office, has never been in any system of government and any military or security agency. I mean, this is the man who didn't even serve in the IDF because they wouldn't call him up because he was such a security threat. When you appoint him as Israel's national security minister in charge of the police and every other domestic security and emergency service, when you appoint another very far-right fascist like Bezalel Smotrich as Israel's Minister of Finance, and the first thing he does is give an interview to a Haredi newspaper saying, they tried socialism, they tried capitalism, I'm going to do it in bechukotai telechu. If you follow God's laws, that's my economic policy, which is, it's great if you want to base the economy on sheer belief, but you do need to run the economy on facts and figures as well. When those are the senior ministers, and I'm not even going to mention the long list of ministers in other, some of them really empty ministries, but they get hundreds of millions in annual funding. When that's your cabinet, then okay, Netanyahu said in his interviews, by the way, he only gave them to the foreign media, he didn't give anything to Israeli media, say, don't worry, I'll be running this government. Somehow that wasn't very confidence inspiring. And when on the second week of the government, Yariv Levin, his justice minister, presented the plan to basically eviscerate the Israeli judiciary, it was clear from many things that the new minister set out to do. This was a government basically just trying to dismantle every part of the Israeli establishment as we've known it since. And one thing about Netanyahu is that for all his talk over the years, he didn't really try and break too many things. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why Israel remained relatively secure in his previous terms. And this government, it was very clear to me that this was a government of chaos. And though I couldn't imagine what had happened on October 7th, I was very fearful from the very early days of this Netanyahu government that if there would be a major security emergency or a war breaking out, that this could be a government that could handle most of the aspects of the war. I wasn't so much worried about the military side because at the end of the day, the IDF, even though Netanyahu has tried and still is trying to undermine Israel's military leadership as much as he can, it's probably the most well-oiled, best organized organization in the Israeli establishment. But other parts of the Israeli administration, of the civil service, ministries, and so on, are not as robust. And we've seen now in the last 6.5 weeks, besides all the bloodshed, besides all the terrible stuff that's happened, we've also seen a breakdown of of the central government in almost every civil department, whether it's welfare, whether it's providing a relief program for by now 150,000 Israelis who've been uprooted by the war, just giving the basic support that the families of 240 hostages need. You know, they waited for weeks to get any kind of information, and they've even been following today. They were supposed to have finally a meeting with the war cabinet, and they were waiting outside the defense ministry in Tel Aviv where it was supposed to happen, and suddenly a quarter of them were told, sorry, we don't have any room for you. There's no auditorium big enough, which is ridiculous. It's a big complex with quite a few big auditoriums. But even to even organize a meeting with the representative of the families and the war cabinet, and for that not to come out as some terrible farce, this government simply isn't capable of. So I'm sorry to say, even before October 7th, I was feeling very insecure about how this government could deal with an emergency situation. And sadly, they've really they've outlived, you know, they've just been beneath every expectation, which was low to begin with.
You said many things I want to follow up on. Maybe just one more minute on the administrative state, because I think for those of us who want to feel confident that Israel is there for us, it is scary to see, you know, we have a story coming about a school that got set up to accommodate children from a community that was evacuated from the Gaza envelope. And according to the folks at the school, like, they kind of just made it up with nobody told them what to do. Nobody helped them. Nobody got them supplies. They're floating it out of their pockets, hoping that they'll get subsidies in the future. It almost doesn't sound real. And so I'm curious, I guess I'd love to hear just one beat more on, like, is it willful? Is it incompetence? Can it be rebuilt? The basic functions of a state.
Well, the willful destruction of the Israeli civil service was going on, and is to a degree is still going on right now. And it was this kind of angry, vindictive atmosphere of this government against the bureaucracy, against the so-called experts and the leftist elites and so on. And one of the places where that was happening was certainly within the education ministry. You had a wholesale resignation of senior civil servants in the ministry. You had basically you had two. By the way, there's two ministers. There's the education minister, and there's the additional education minister who is in charge of all the Haredi education, because the Haredi party's got their own minister there. And you have these two ministers who are basically abandoning all the pedagogical, all the organizational plans that were put in place by previous governments, because this is a government which has also thrown out every single plan that existed, not because the plans were good, but they didn't even examine them. Just, these are the plans of the last government. That was the Lapid Bennett government. They were terrible. We're throwing out everything they did. And I'm not saying everything the Lapid Bennett government did was good, and there was criticism of some of the plans. For example, in education, in the 18 months of the Bennett Lapid government, the point is that this was a government which didn't really have a constructive plan for anything. It was really just bent on just really burning down the house. And you know, this story that you just described now that you'll be running, it's not at all surprising. This is a situation from every single direction we're looking at, and where things are working, they're working either because there are some local authorities which are doing a good job. Like you say, they're still waiting for the funding, but they're trying to do what they can. And because many of the communities which were the worst hit on October 7 were kibbutzim. Now, kibbutzim have been much maligned, sometimes with some justification over the years. They're not what they used to be in so many ways, certainly not in their place in wider Israeli society, but they are one thing, they're strong communities. And the kibbutz movement, or the two kibbutz movements, without going into too much of Israeli left-wing history and of the splits, but the kibbutz, the broad kibbutz movement is a strong movement when it comes to individual communities. And when all those kibbutzim were almost destroyed on October 7th, so many of their members killed and wounded and taken hostage, and everybody who survived had to leave because their homes became, if their homes are still standing even, became a war zone. The kibbutz movement throughout the country came together, and they all had somewhere to go. They all had like an adopting kibbutz somewhere else in the country, which took them in, which have already set up these schools that they don't have, because that's what they do. These are communities, and we're seeing here some of the best of Israel, both in the way Israelis have come together, both to help the families and communities which have been uprooted, the way Israelis have come together in military service. Those are the best parts of Israel, the service, the people who are just prepared to volunteer. And so many of the groups who were involved in the protests against the government in the 9 months before the war have overnight turned into volunteering groups and groups who are supplying everything that is necessary for the people who have been uprooted in ways that the government hasn't even started to think about. So things aren't collapsing in Israel because it turns out that Israeli society is much stronger than anybody thought, something over the last year of protests and division. And there are very, very strong communities and groups within Israeli society, but very, very little, if anything, of this is coming from the central government.
I want to shift back to the hostages. For those of us in the diaspora, I bet that the folks in this room together, we could come up with the names of every single hostage that's known. These people are on our minds all the time. Our communities are talking about them. Their faces are plastered on our telephone poles, torn down from those places. They're very, very present. And I think, and you've written about this, I think a question that's really staring us in the face isn't the goal of rooting out and demolishing Hamas at odds with the goal of getting the hostages back? And how do you think about that? And how do you think folks within the government and the army are thinking about that?
Well, there's an almost impossible tension there, and that was Hamas's goal, and that they succeeded by taking a large number of hostages. It makes Israel's military response that much more difficult, and I certainly don't envy any of the members of the war cabinet and senior generals in the IDF and other parts of the security establishment who have to deal in every decision they make, need to somehow balance the issue of the safety and trying to do everything to make sure that those hostages come back home alive, with the absolute necessity of making sure that this never happens again. And to make sure it never happens again, Hamas as a military entity has to be destroyed, and that's a huge mission as well. So the tension there is constant, but that is also, at the end of the day, part of what their job is to do, to provide security. Certainly in a time of emergency, you need to try and balance priorities. What one hopes is that the decisions are made in the most professional and serious manner, and that's not necessarily what we're seeing happening. Certainly in the parts of the government, thankfully, those parts of the government are not represented right now in the war cabinet. They still have an influence. We saw it earlier today in the really shameful Knesset committee meeting over the death sentence. Now, it was just a ridiculous meeting to begin with, because the death sentence is on the books in Israel. It hasn't been used since, I'm sure many of viewers right now know, since 1962, with the execution of Adolf Eichmann. It hasn't been something that Israel's ever used, but it exists. Now, the debate of whether a prosecutor in a future trial of Hamas terrorists should demand the death penalty, and whether the judges should use it, that will be a debate that will probably have to be had at some point. But it's not something that the Knesset needs to be having, because the Knesset is a legislative body. That legislation already exists. So why did the meeting happen today? The meeting happened today because there are these fascists under Ben-Gvir who want to glorify the idea of a death sentence. You had the families begging them, the families of the hostages, and they came to the committee to do that. Don't talk about this right now. It's not necessary. If you want to talk, we can talk about it at a future point when these trials of those who perpetrated the massacre on Simchat Torah are held. Those trials aren't being held yet. So why are you having this now? Why bring this in when our main concern is the safety of our loved ones who are being held by Hamas? And you see, basically, Ben-Gvir, I mean, he came and hugged, he forced himself on one of the family members. It was one of the most obscene things that I've ever seen happening in the Knesset. Believe me, I've seen a lot of obscene things happening in the Knesset. And they asked in advance, they sent a message in advance in Netanyahu's office, can you try and prevent this meeting? And he didn't, because he is humoring the fascists in his government, because he feels rightly that his political survival is based on them. So, this is just one tiny example of how the welfare and the safety of the hostages is not being prioritized, and instead they're holding this obscene and totally superfluous in any legislative sense session on camera in the Knesset. So, when this happens, I certainly can't be sure that the Prime Minister and some of his ministers are correctly balancing these very difficult and even for the biggest professionals, it's those who are totally looking at this without any political bias, these two issues of ensuring the safety of the hostages and at the same time going to war against Hamas. These priorities are very, very difficult to balance, and I don't in any way trust those who are supposed to be balancing it right now.
Can you help us understand, what are Bibi's incentives here? Does he benefit if the war is concluded? Is it in his interest to carry on with uncertain success? Because I think our understanding is, or he has said, everyone has said, the reckoning will come when the war is over. So why would he want that to happen?
Well, he has two incentives. First of all, to stay in power. It's not in his DNA to resign. The man he just very recently turned 74, and he's only been for 16 years in total in power. It's not enough for him. He doesn't see anybody else who can replace him. He doesn't want to be in any other job but the Prime Minister of Israel. And he has his eye on his historic record, on his legacy. And he's said so many times in so many interviews that he wants to be seen as the man who guaranteed Israel's security. And I don't think it's totally sunk in for him yet that he won't be allowed to remain in power for very long after this war, and that his historic legacy is forever tainted. It doesn't really matter what happened in the previous 16 years of his total that he's been in as prime minister and all the other things he's done as in his long, very, very long public career. He will now be tainted forever as the prime minister who led Israel into this most terrible of its tragedies in its 75 years of existence. And I think he still thinks that he can somehow change that record, that there is something he can do, that Israel will reach this point where things will be a lot better, and he can somehow take credit for that. He said he's going to try and take credit for anything good. I mean, you're seeing him now taking credit for the solidarity being shown to Israel by foreign leaders. This is Joe Biden, who wouldn't talk to you for 10 months and didn't invite you once to the White House since he became president, and I did everything to show how much he doesn't want to be seen with you, Netanyahu. But Netanyahu is now taking credit for all the phone calls and Biden's visit and everything else the United States is doing as if it's his own personal achievement. And this is Netanyahu's way of doing this forever. Take credit for anything good that happens, even if it's nothing to do with you, and blame anything bad that happens on everyone else. And this is what he's doing now with the war. The war is this huge event that needs so much resources and so much of the bandwidth of Israel's leadership, and so much of his bandwidth is occupied by his political survival, by his attempts to try and brief the bits of the Israeli media which perhaps are still prepared to listen to him, and blame everyone else for everything that happened, on sending all these sort of quiet messages to thousands of social media proxies who are attacking everybody and saying how wonderful he is. So much of that is going into things which have nothing to do with running this war. That it's obvious that Netanyahu is constantly fighting. Netanyahu's the day after strategy isn't what are we going to do with Gaza, and how is Israel going to ensure its security, and how are we going to deal with the destruction that is now in Gaza, and what we're going to do with the 2.whatever million Gazans who most of them have lost their homes and are cut off. None of that is really taking up the major part of Netanyahu's time as much as his own political survival is.
And are there people who are focused on those questions and creating plans for those questions? And I guess I'm curious about the left and what is happening there, and I guess who is thinking about all these things that ought to be thought about, that you think that you're saying, you know, the prime minister is not giving adequate attention to.
Well, these are political and diplomatic issues which should be the responsibility of the politicians, of the government, of the National Security Council, and so on. And no real discussion is happening there about the day after, because there's no way to reach any kind of agreement between the pragmatic. Okay, so now that you've got Gantz and Eisenkot in the government, you've got some centrists who are sort of pragmatic. So, you know, and let's say that Netanyahu understands that there are various things that need to be done, and perhaps the defense minister, Yoav Gallant. So you do have a sort of pragmatic wing to this government, at least the temporarily expanded government. But all the parts of the government upon which Netanyahu relies for his survival won't hear any kind of discussion on any type of day after strategy, which isn't basically the idea of staying there and having no type of Palestinian entity with any kind of support. And actually, even though the more senior members of the government from the far right aren't really saying it openly, they basically want to rebuild settlements and not allow Palestinians back into Gaza City, which doesn't, you know, where they're going to be then. So the places where that discussion should be happening, it isn't really happening. It's happening in parts of the defense establishment, because the IDF and the other parts of the defense establishment need to have some kind of idea of what's the next stage, or what the long-term strategy should be, just to do the next steps of the war. But they're not really supposed to be doing this. This is not a question in which generals should be perhaps preparing plans and presenting options to the government. But this is not the job of the generals. But they're doing it quietly because they have no choice. Israel needs to have a strategy, and if the strategy isn't being provided by the politicians who are at the top of the hierarchy, then those who are beneath them are trying to somehow guess what their strategy should be. As the left goes, I mean, I love it when people talk about the Israeli left as if it's something which actually exists. I don't know who you mean by the Israeli left. Benny Gantz's party is a sort of right-leaning centrist party. Yair Lapid is a centrist, also probably more leaning to the right than the left. There isn't any real Israeli left, and there's Haaretz, and there's Labour, which is a party which is totally demoralized with just 4 Knesset members. Meretz was wiped out because of the eternal splits in the left in the last election. There isn't an Israeli left. There are people who want and believe that there should be some kind of pragmatic solution, something on the lines of the two-state solution. But I think even those who do see themselves as being the left in Israel are also shell-shocked. I mean, nobody comes out well from what happened. You know, if you're part of what they used to call the peace camp, and for the last 30 years you said, We'll find a way of dealing with the Palestinians, and we'll find a solution, a diplomatic solution, and that will guarantee peace. So yes, we can, and I'm of that part of the Israeli political spectrum. So we can say, yes, we were right, and you should have done that. But it's not a very easy argument to make when Israel has just been attacked by a group of Palestinians who have massacred, burned, raped, and pillaged entire Israeli communities. So yes, I still think we need to try and make that argument that only some kind of a diplomatic solution in some kind of two-state framework can ultimately guarantee some kind of stability to Israel. But that's going to be a very, very long uphill struggle now to Israelis, because on the one hand, if you look at the polls, some very interesting things can be seen right now, and Israel has been conducting lots of polls in the last few weeks. You see a massive consensus against Netanyahu. You say 75% of Israelis want him to resign either right now or the moment the war is over. 75% is his party, Likud, has lost almost half of its vote in the polls. But at the same time, you see a hardening of views in Israel, people feeling a lot more suspicious of the Palestinians, a lot more suspicious of the prospects of any type of diplomatic solution. And you also see across the board, and this is including on what you call the Israeli left, perhaps with the exception of the very, very, very far left, you also see a consensus in favor of this war. I don't hear amongst my lefty friends anybody, except once again on the very, very left, far left fringe of that, people are saying we shouldn't be fighting this war. And with all the terrible destruction that has been caused to Gaza City and the many thousands of Palestinians who have been killed so far in this war, and a large proportion of whom are civilians, I'm not sensing on the Israeli mainstream left, if you want to call it that, any less support for the war. I mean, it's as if there's Netanyahu is one thing, and the issues of what should happen in the future are another thing, and the war in its current state is a third thing. And Israelis are addressing each of these things separately. They're in favor of the war, left, right, center, except for a small group who is still, for some reason, loyal to him against Netanyahu. And we're going to have this massive, massive argument when we've got some kind of breathing point, if we get to that breathing point, at the end of this war of, okay, what's next in Gaza? And that's a discussion that we should be having now, but we're incapable of having it now because on the one hand, the government is totally dysfunctional, so they're not having that discussion. And on the other hand, Israeli society is simply mobilized for the war effort. So you can't, I think it's almost inhuman to expect Israelis, certainly, I mean, ordinary Israelis who are either themselves directly have been called up, or their family members, or they're somehow involved in the war effort in so many other ways, to expect Israelis to have this kind of conversation now. What are we going to be doing on the day after in Gaza? It really is. I think it's unrealistic to expect ordinary Israelis to have that conversation. We should be expecting the government to have that, but the government is incapable, even more incapable than ordinary Israelis to have that discussion.
I see a few questions from attendees about both the West Bank and Arab Israelis within Israel and intra-communal relations within Israel. And I think there was a real fear early on that some of the mixed cities would explode in the way that they did in 2021. And I think that's something that we haven't really seen. I think everyone here would appreciate your insights about what's the sense, communal, sense within Israel, and then a few words about the West Bank and what's happening there.
So one of the most important things when we're talking about responses of the Palestinians is not to treat them as a monolithic group. And to a large degree, even though there is such a thing as a Palestinian identity and solidarity, what we've seen in so many of the rounds of warfare in the last few decades is that you don't usually see all the Palestinian groups taking part. So, very roughly, and even there, it's far from monolithic. But you've got Gaza with its 2+ million people. You've got the West Bank with its 3+ million people. You talk about the Palestinians, they're not the settlers. You've got East Jerusalem, which is about 300,000 to 400,000 Palestinians, and then you've got non-Jewish Israelis, some of whom identify as Palestinians, some of them identify as, some of them are Druze or Bedouins and don't usually identify as Palestinians. Their number is, roughly 2.5 million. And I don't think we should be necessarily surprised that we didn't see, like we did see in May 2021, when there was the previous round of warfare in Gaza, we saw also all this violent rioting in some of the mixed cities, because that wasn't a normal thing. There have been so many rounds of warfare with Gaza for 20 years, and it didn't happen then either. It happened back in October 2000, when the second Intifada began, and it happened in May 2021. So it's not necessarily something that you should expect to happen every time there's a period of emergency or war in Gaza or an Intifada. It happened in intervals of over 2 decades. I think there are also a lot of important developments happening amongst the Arab, Israeli, or non-Jewish minority groups. You saw in the previous government, the Bennett-Lapid government, you saw for the first time an independent Arab Israeli party entering the coalition. And that is the party which in some ways is ideologically close to Hamas, because Mansour Abbas's Ram party is a conservative Islamist party as well. They're not like Hamas, but there are some sort of ideological sources which they do share. And that was actually the party which became the first party to come into an first Arab independent party to come into Israeli coalition. I think that has had a huge effect. Also, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of an ongoing process of what some people call Israelization amongst some of the Arab Israeli communities. So I think that even though we saw this really terrible and frightening outbreak of violence back in May 21, that wasn't the norm. And the norm is a much more nuanced, much more complex kind of relationship, which is constantly evolving within Israeli society between the Jewish mainstream and those groups. And I think we've seen a lot of actually acts of solidarity. So I think that a lot of them were really revolted by what they saw on October 7, and and there were also, of course, Arab, Israeli, and Bedouin and Druze casualties, and some of them also among the hostages. So there has been, I think, more of a solidarity within Israeli society than we've seen in previous wars and rounds of violence. And I think there are other reasons as well that perhaps, also the fact that there is a justified fear from the police under Ben Gvir, and some people see this as a success of Ben Gvir, but what a price. As far as the West Bank goes, the West Bank is certainly not a happy place right now. You've got a lot of Palestinians there who are very supportive of Hamas, at least according to the 1 or 2 surveys that we've seen. And you have massive acts of, not so much massive, but so many widespread acts of provocation by settlers, sadly, in some cases, with support by some elements, some kind of reserve soldiers, perhaps, in the IDF who are stationed there right now. And despite all those acts of provocation, we're not seeing a massive outbreak of violence. And I think there are 2 main reasons for that. One is a political reason. Hamas attacked Israeli communities on October 7, but it did so, at least in part, in its bid for leadership of the Palestinian people. They wanted to show, and they did show to the Palestinians and to the Arab world and to everyone else, that they are much more violent, certainly, and from their perspective, much more effective in achieving results than the corrupt Palestinian Authority dominated by their political rivals, Fatah. And Fatah saw that as well. And Fatah isn't about to say, you know what, Hamas, come on, you take control of the West Bank. No, Fatah are a political movement, and they don't want to let Fatah, they don't want to let Hamas take over the West Bank. the Palestinian Authority only has its own semi-autonomous enclaves, but so it doesn't want to give up on that. So whatever power they have, and they're also a police state, slightly more benign than Hamas, not that much better, but they're also clamping down on any type of dissent within the Palestinian cities, any type of open support for Hamas. So that's a huge factor in preventing any outbreak. And also, the support for Hamas doesn't necessarily, in the West Bank, doesn't necessarily translate itself into violence and into action. People, as somebody said to me today, people watch Al Jazeera, and I hope nobody here watches Al Jazeera with any sense of belief. Al Jazeera is a Hamas-supporting Qatari mouthpiece. There was perhaps a point where we had some appreciation for Al Jazeera for being this kind of brave, truth-telling Arab channel that's long ago, and any illusions of that are long ago disappeared. But what we do, but you know, they're watching Al Jazeera and they're rooting for Hamas, but they're doing it in their homes on a 50-inch television screen, and they don't necessarily want to be in another intifada. The older ones still have a memory of how damaging the second intifada was to the Palestinian communities in the West Bank, and they certainly don't want to go back to that. Some of the younger generation perhaps maybe a bit more inclined to do that, but there isn't that type of motivation. An intifada is something where is an event. We've had two of them when you have just across the board, just widespread, insurrection, and that's not. And despite everything that's happened, despite the popularity of Hamas, despite the really nasty provocations of the settlers, that there isn't yet any real sign of that happening. And once again, we have to be looking at each of these Palestinian arenas or communities or whatever, looking at them, at each of them in their own, with their own, they're each of them in a different place, they're each of them under different jurisdiction. And each of them, even despite the Palestinian solidarity and identity, which is shared, each of them also have their own set of calculations. Do we want to jeopardize things that we have? We want to sacrifice. Is this the point where we want to have a confrontation with Israel? And we haven't had, Gaza is at war because Hamas began a war with Israel. We're not seeing any real desire in any of the three others, West Bank, East Jerusalem, or Palestinian Israelis, Arab Israelis, to have anything like that kind of a confrontation right now.
We have about 5 minutes. I want to wedge in two questions. One is just a minute or two each. One is you mentioned that within Israel, even those on the left are in favor of the war, supporting the war, probably doing a lot physically with their time and energy to support the war. There isn't.
They're fighting the war. Yeah.
They're fighting the war, and then those who are, everybody's involved in the war, and you said it's only the very fringe that's not. I think in the U.S. we've seen, even in the last couple of days, among the 34 Jewish Democrats in Congress, a few of them have come out in favor of a ceasefire. We've seen the Israeli Saturday Night Live pillorying left-wing Americans. Couldn't tell if they were pillorying left-wing American Jews on college campuses for calling for ceasefire and opposing the war, but there certainly are Jews who are espousing that view. And I'm curious, what's the perception of U.S. Jews from where you sit?
Well, U.S. Jews is a population almost as big as Israeli Jews, or depends how you measure and how you count your Jews. Bigger even by some counts. And I certainly, I've covered diaspora affairs in the past. I certainly don't lump all American Jews into one group. And I think some Israelis, I'm not sure how many, are also capable of taking this nuanced view. And yes, there are some Jews in America who have chosen not to show solidarity with Israel, and that's very sad. And I think they will be judged by history. But I'm not sure that this is really anywhere near in the top 10 or top 20 issues that are bothering Israelis right now. And, Israel has seen a leader in the last, in this lack of leadership that we have here in Israel. We had a leader for a few hours. His name was Joe Biden. He was here. And we saw what real leadership looked like. And I think Joe Biden didn't need, certainly he's somebody with very, very close relations, as always has, with American Jewish community or communities. But he didn't need that to be pro-Israel, and I think he didn't. I don't think he made political consideration. I think he did what he thought was right, both from a moral standpoint and also from America's geopolitical interests. America is facing Russia and China in these big stakes wars, and you've got the Ukrainian situation. As far as Biden is concerned, Israel and Ukraine are both two fronts in which America has to do so much and is doing so much. And whether you want to say Baruch Hashem, thank God for Joe Biden, or just say Kol HaKavod, way to go. American Jews are part of that, and I think most Israelis, I know I am, and you can probably hear from my accent that I hail from the big place where people speak proper English, and not from America. There's a lot of concern for diaspora communities, and those who are following the news certainly are seeing a lot of worrying stuff happening both in Europe and in Britain and in America. Sadly, we have so many problems right now here that it's hard to say what Israelis are thinking about it, because we do have slightly bigger problems closer to home.
Of course. And I guess last question, give us the 1-minute pitch. You told us a lot of reasons to be really gravely concerned about Israel and its future and its leadership. Give us the 1-minute pitch for why we should have hope. Why we should hope for Israel's future right now.
Well, I said it before, and I think that's a huge source of hope. Israeli society is much stronger than perhaps we felt over this past year of political strife in Israel. We're seeing it in so many ways, and let's put aside the fact that left and right and settlers and religious and secular and so on are all serving together now in the IDF, and a huge number, by the way, certainly beyond the proportion of communities like the Druze community and the Bedouin community. Small numbers of Arab Israelis are also now in the IDF. By the way, a huge proportion than any other war of women soldiers on the battlefield in so many roles. And it's just incredible to see. And I saw it up close of how, despite all this nasty stuff being said by some right-wing rabbis against women soldiers, they're on the battlefield and they're excellent and just so moving. Some of the sacrifices they've made. So, but put all that aside, and I know I've already overstepped my minute pitch. Israeli society is much more strong, much more resilient, much better united, much better organized, and resourceful and justified than any of its politicians gave us any right to expect. We're much better than our government. We're winning. We're winning. We're winning. And sacrifice has been terrible, and it still is terrible. And it's very difficult, but we should also be looking at terrible things happening to civilians. On the other side, I think Hamas is to blame for most of that. But Israeli society is winning, and when this is over, we'll also clean up the stables in the Knesset and in the government. That day is not far off, and I am optimistic. As difficult and as heavy as these days are, I am very optimistic.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here, for joining us again so late at night. I think we will all be riveted to your columns and the news coming out of your newsroom, and hopeful that the story will improve. Thank you everyone for taking time out of your afternoon to be here. We will share this recording. You can share it with anybody who wasn't able to make it. Keep your questions coming, and thank you all.
And thank you for having me, Philissa and JTA. You're doing an excellent job as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you.